Welcome so much to another Trident Contract Success webinar. What companies need to know about CMMC, where we are, where we've been, and where we think we're heading. I'm Jeff Everidge, the president owner of Trident Proposal Management. I'm joined today by Morgan Over and Rebecca Whalen from the Trident team, and we are so excited to bring Townsend Bourne to our Contract Success series to talk about this really important topic that's looming large on our government industry. Townsend, if you wouldn't mind advancing the slide. And everybody, just while she's doing that, just know that this is being recorded. The recording will be put out in the wild, and you'll be getting a note with the recording in case you want to share it with someone else. So again, I'm Trident, the Trident Proposal Management owner and president. I'm a Naval Academy grad, veteran, and I'm also a government proposal presentation coach. If you're not familiar with that, sometimes the government adds a presentation to an RFP, and I coach those presentations. And Townsend's going to introduce herself in more detail, but Townsend is our guest speaker. She's from Sheppard, Mullin. She is a CMMC ninja, we like to call her. Out of DC, as we said, and she'll go deeper into her background here in a second. So as this is a free webinar full of great information, we do take a minute to talk about Trident. Next slide, please, Townsend. So Trident, we believe our mission and our values truly set us apart as a company in the space. So our mission, as you might guess, is we help government contractors identify, position for, and win contracts. That's both new blue, white, bluebird white space contracts, as well as helping them defend their current contracts, their current business. We do that with professional staff and quality service. And we're committed to, and our lifeblood, if you will, is our people. And we're committed to creating flexible, portable jobs for drilling reservists, veterans, and spouses, military spouses all over the world. And I'll just point out that Rebecca Whalen is our chief of staff. She's on our leadership team. She's been full-time for 10 years now, and she's a military spouse, and I think she's moved 6 times since she joined Trident. And then Morgan Over joined us as a mil spouse from Korea, no less, and recently moved to North Carolina. So we practice what we preach on our commitment. Our core values, military level professionalism, just like the military that we serve in so many ways as defense contractors. My team hits the ground running and acts with professional demeanor, keeps calm under stress, and works as hard as we need to work. We bring a team approach, so we're not just a staffing firm, or heck, we're not a staffing firm at all. We bring full-time, part-time employees to deal with your hardest proposal and capture problems. We're client-centered, we own our outcome, and one thing about our industry is it's easy to burn out as a proposal and a capture professional, and we do everything in our power to help us thrive, and that's shown by the longevity of our employees in our industry and in our firm. Enough about Trident, though. Next slide, please. I want to introduce our speaker now and the firm that she represents. So Sheppard Mullin is a global law firm with offices in DC, heck, every major city, and also here in San Diego. And a dear friend of mine is how we were connected to Townsend to do this CMMC webinar. And so then that's John Tischler, if you know him, in San Diego. They specialize in government regulatory matters and investigations, corporate and technology transactions, and high stakes litigation. And they're highly ranked in government contracts practice, headquartered in DC. So just a great firm to be familiar with and to have in your Rolodex in case you have an issue in the government space. They're the ones that'll help you. And next slide, please. With that, I will hand it over to our special guest and CMMC Ninja, Townsend.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I'm happy to be here, and it is a great synergy between us. I come from a Navy family. My dad also went to the Naval Academy, so sorry to Chris, who seems to favor the Army in the chat there, but I'm on the Navy side for that one. So I'm very excited to be here today. I think most of you on the call are probably familiar with CMMC, and we've got a polling question up for you right now in the chat if you want to go ahead and answer that while I'm going over my introduction. But this is an area where industrial base are going to have to understand this and are going to have to take some additional actions in the very near future for compliance. So what I'd like to do today really is I think understanding the future of CMMC and what DoD is going to be expecting is really informed by kind of the last couple years when this program's been rolled out. So hence the title today, which is where we are, where we've been, and where we think we're headed. So I'd like to give you, in as much as I can in the next 50 minutes or so, kind of a comprehensive overview, and then dig into some of the details of a new proposed rule that we just got on CMMC. Next slide, please.
So, hey, before you move on, it looks like most of the respondents are working on it. So we're working on it right now. So they're working on becoming CMMC qualified. Only had one person in the chat say that we would pass today. And then a couple other people said that we're watching and waiting for guidance. Hasn't been a bad strategy, I'll say. And then some are just learning about it today.
Perfect.
That's your group.
I think that's consistent with what we're seeing across industry. I think a couple years ago, people were starting to understand and take a harder look at this program, but there was still so much uncertainty. And we were hearing some chatter of companies kind of waiting it out to see if this really was going to happen. Now I think it's clear it's really going to happen. So it's good that the majority of people are working on it. But as I'll go over, there is still some time, and the way this plan is going to be rolled out, it's going to be a couple years before it becomes fully effective. So we'll talk about the timing as well. I don't want to spend too much time on this slide. Mostly, if we're circulating the slides, the links to some of the articles that me and my team have put out on CMMC and other government cybersecurity initiatives are there. So those may be helpful to you in the future. As Jeff already mentioned, I am a partner based out of Sheppard Mullin's Washington, D.C. office in our governmental practice group. I also lead our firm's government business group, which is an industry team that brings together attorneys in various practice areas and offices across the firm that serve our clients that sell either directly or indirectly to the federal government. I also lead the firm's governmental practice, cybersecurity, and data protection team. Next slide. This is what I'd like to cover today. As I mentioned, kind of going through a little bit of background, talking about the current state of things, then talking about the future. We talked about this yesterday, or I guess it was on Monday during our pre-call, that we've actually had this presentation scheduled for a while now, but the date is perfect because we got the Title 48 CMMC proposed rule 2 weeks ago. And just last week, we saw the first DOJ complaint filed in a civil cyber fraud case relating to DoD cybersecurity requirements. So I updated this presentation a little bit over the last week to build in some information about that case, because I think it really shows particularly what DOJ is going to be looking at when they're investigating cases alleging cybersecurity fraud under DoD regulations. So we'll talk a little bit about that in terms of where we are. So what do the CMMC rules look like? What's expected? And also kind of on the enforcement side of things, what are the key risk areas that could potentially cause a company to be subject to a civil cyber fraud case? I see we have the next poll up, so that's great.
Yeah, so this poll is, when it comes to CMMC, what concerns you the most? Is it the unnecessary work you might be doing now? Is it not being ready in time? Is it costs, a very high cost of compliance? Are there technical challenges that you see really hard to get by, or something else that we didn't put? Give it another minute or two. We have 5 responses and 35 people on the call. All right, people. We need more response. We're going to hold you hostage. More responses. 8 responses. Looks like the cost is definitely winning that race there. It's certainly for Trident specifically. We look at some of the things we need for level 2 and think, wow, that's going to be expensive and technically difficult as well. Anyone else have answer to our question? All right, it looks like the costs are the big concern here. Back to you, Townsend.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and that makes sense. And we'll talk a little bit about that and the costs and what DoD is saying about that issue. Next slide, please. This is a timeline to kind of give you a sense of where we are with DoD and their cybersecurity program. Really, this timeline should go back to 2015, 2016, which is when we saw the newest version of DoD's clause for safeguarding covered defense information and cyber incident reporting. That is a clause that is currently a DFARS requirement. Most of you probably have that in your DoD contracts and subcontracts. We refer to it fondly as the DFARS 7012 clause. 7012 are the last four numbers of that DFARS clause. But essentially, that clause said DoD contractors are going to have an obligation to safeguard covered defense information within their own systems when they're performing DoD work. And it said that it set a standard for what that security should look like. And it also required that contractors report to DoD when they have a cyber incident. When DoD rolled that clause out, and for several years, it took the position that it was not going to require contractors to have a third-party assessment or really take any actions to certify to cybersecurity compliance. DoD's position was, if you're signing a contract with us, you're representing that you've completed the security requirements in this clause. There was an OIG audit and some other reviews that happened where DoD was made aware that a lot of companies weren't necessarily fulfilling all these requirements. They didn't necessarily understand them. It was confusing. So in 2020 and really 2019 is when we first saw DoD talking about this, but DoD first announced that it was going to institute the CMMC program, and that's the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification Program. So it was rolled out as a way for DoD to insist that its contractors take additional actions to assess and get a third-party certification for cybersecurity. You'll see, and I think most of you on the call probably know, that the rollout of this has been somewhat tumultuous, and it's been almost 4 years now. After they introduced the program, which now we call it CMMC 1.0 because we're on 2.0 now, but they introduced at the end of 2020 a new interim rule that became effective in November of 2020 that announced the plans for the CMMC program. It included a new DFARS clause for the CMMC program, although it said that that clause was not going to be effective and it generally should not appear in contracts until the CMMC program was finalized. One important thing that it did, though, is it added a DFARS clause for contractors that have covered defense information to have an assessment or perform a self-assessment against the cybersecurity standards in that DFARS 7012 clause that was already in the books, and then assign themselves a score. So DoD put out an assessment methodology with a scoring methodology for companies to self-assess, come up with their score, and then report that score to DoD. So those are current requirements in the DFARS, and they're kind of the stepping stones that get us to CMMC. In 2021, after DoD got, I think, over 800 comments in response to that rule that came out at the end of 2020, they decided to initiate an internal review of the CMMC program. The CMMC 1.0 version, if any of you were following this, it was a little bit more complicated than what we've got now in that it had 5 levels of certification, whereas now we have 3, and I'll talk about what those are on a few slides. And it also had security controls that were going to be defined by DoD, whereas now the 3 levels associated with CMMC 2.0 align with other resources that are already requirements. So it streamlines a little bit what needs to be done for contractors to get to CMMC compliance, and makes it a little bit more understandable, I think, and a little bit more compact. So we'll talk about that. Then I'm still on the bottom here. In the middle there, you see CMMC 2.0 was announced in November of 2021. So that's when we saw this new structure for CMMC with 3 levels instead of 5, and with some different expectations for what would have to happen at each of the levels. In the interim there, the Biden administration released an executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity. Now that's a separate initiative from CMMC, but I think it's important to understand how a lot of this fits together, particularly where I would expect that most of the people on this call, where they work with the DoD, they also are going to have FAR requirements, so the civilian agency requirements in their contracts, and they may also be doing work with other agencies outside of DoD that have specific cybersecurity requirements as well. But I will reiterate, when we're talking about CMMC, that is a DoD-only program right now. So if you work with other agencies, they likely are not going to have a certification requirement for cybersecurity, but they may have their own cybersecurity regulations. Then I love this slide. My associate put these crickets in here because we really didn't hear anything about CMMC for about 2 years. After CMMC 2.0 was announced, DoD was engaged in a rulemaking effort to put out new proposed rules to redefine the program and really detail what was going to be required. And during that rulemaking process, as you can imagine, DoD doesn't generally like to talk too much about that before they put out their proposed rule. So we finally got to the moment everyone had been waiting for at the end of December last year. I think this proposed rule came out on December 26th or 27th. It definitely impacted me and my team's holiday break, which was fine because I love this stuff. But in December of 2023, what we were calling the Title 32 proposed rule came out, and this is sort of the legal side of things, but just so you all know, there are 2 separate rulemakings going on that relate to the CMMC program. Title 32 is the section of the U.S. Code of Federal Regulations that deals with national security and DoD policy. So that's the section that really sets forth a lot of the detail about CMMC, what DoD officials need to do, and it's very comprehensive. You'll see the final dot on this timeline for this month is when we got the Title 48 proposed rule. And that's the proposed rule that will amend the DFARS to impose CMMC requirements on contractors. So while both rules, the Title 32 rule and the Title 48 rule, are important, and I'll talk about both, the Title 48 rule is really what binds companies and contractors to these requirements, and it is the trigger for when the CMMC program becomes effective. And we'll talk about that a little more too. The last thing on the slide I want to point out is this red star in the middle. That is the date, October 2021, when DOJ announced its Civil Cyber Fraud Initiative. So in conjunction with DoD rolling out its CMMC program, the Biden administration releasing an executive order with a lot of new anticipated requirements and focus on cybersecurity, DOJ announced a new initiative to specifically look at and target contractor cybersecurity fraud. And under that initiative so far, I think we have 6 or 7 settlements, and now we have 1 active case in which the DOJ has just last week filed a complaint against Georgia Tech and related entities in a civil cyber fraud case. So a lot of different things going on I want to make sure people are aware of, even though our focus today is CMMC.
Hey,
Next slide.
Townsend, on that note, just everyone, you may have questions already for Townsend, and we have 2 ways to do it. Our preferred method is the Q&A tab, which is enabled. So you just hit that Q&A tab at the top and put in your question there, or you can put it in the chat. We're monitoring both. So guys, please do get your questions in there, and we have some Q&A time at the end. And if a lot of people are asking the same question, I may stop Townsend and ask the question as well. Townsend, back to you.
Perfect. Thank you. I do have the chat box up, but it may be hard for me to monitor both. So I'll rely on you a little bit for that, Jeff.
Yeah, don't worry about it at all. I got it.
Perfect. Okay, so this is a list. I don't need to go through in too much detail, but this sort of gives you a sense of all the different cybersecurity initiatives happening right now in the US. So that executive order has a lot in it. It has, I think, 9 or 10 different sections, really focused on what agencies are going to do with respect to cyber. but it does call for new FAR clauses, which we've already seen some of them come out. And the main topics for those are cyber incident reporting and information sharing and software security. So there are some initiatives there on contractors who provide software to the government needing to attest to utilizing secure software development practices, and rules that we're expecting to come out soon that will require additional incident reporting. Also, there's been a really big push recently out of the Biden administration on identifying prohibited sources in the US supply chain. That's another kind of big area that me and my team follow. Right in the middle there with the star, we've got DoD and CMMC, which has really been kind of leading the charge on a lot of agency efforts to protect sensitive government information. We've also got CERCIA, which is an act out of CISA that is going to require certain measures for companies that are part of our critical infrastructure and reporting cyber incidents impacting critical infrastructure. The SEC put out a rule on disclosing cybersecurity incidents that applies to publicly traded companies. I already mentioned the DOJ Civil Cyber Fraud Initiative. And then something else to be aware of where you're contracting with state and local governments, there may be state and local cybersecurity related requirements that are also in place. So there's a big universe here of different types of rules that you may be subject to, in addition to DoD and CMMC's rules. Next slide. Okay, I think were we going to throw up a polling question here, Jeff?
Yes, we were. You stole my thunder. So Morgan, if you could put the last polling question up. Hey, Morgan, hopefully we didn't lose you. You there? Okay. All right. I think we might have lost Morgan.
Okay,
So
I'll move on. That's okay.
yeah, and then we'll continue.
Okay, next slide, please.
Oh my goodness, is
I
she?
think she was advancing my slides.
Oh boy. Oh, there we
There
go.
we go.
Ah, here's
Perfect.
the poll. All right. So what level are you targeting to start? So if you know the different, we're about to go deep into the difference in the levels, but if you know ahead of time what level you think you're going to be targeting, pop that in the poll. I know that we are looking at level 2. I'll submit that. A number of people are looking at level 2. We got 9 responses. Not sure. This is the place to be if you're not sure, and also the place to be if you think you might be thinking about level 3 versus level 2. But Townsend, it looks like a lot of folks are thinking level 2 is the place they need to set.
Yep, and that is not surprising to me. We'll talk about each of the levels, and I think level 2 would be where I would expect most companies in the space to be. Although, of course, level 1, when DoD first put out this rule, they had a number of companies they expected to be at level 1. So I don't want to discredit level 1. That is certainly a legitimate place to be. It just depends on the type of information you're handling.
I can tell you, I was hoping that we, as a service provider, could be level 1, but level 1 seems like it's a very, very small subset of us that'll be level 1.
Yeah, unfortunately, I mean, it will require a determination of the type of information, but it does seem like, particularly where companies are going to be in a subcontractor role, the primes may want to see level 2 regardless. So that's something to work through as well, depending on your position in the DoD supply chain. So,
Yeah,
okay.
And just so everybody knows, I am tracking your chat questions and Q&A questions. Keep them coming for sure. Back to you, Townsend.
Thank you, Jeff. This is just an overview. So CMMC, I think we already have established there are progressively advanced levels requiring more security controls depending on the type of DoD information and the type of program your company is performing under. The idea was to make sure that there was a unified standard here, and what the CMMC program and the DoD and the FAR regulations focus on really is whether your company has federal contract information and or controlled unclassified information. So those are the 2 key terms I'm going to talk about today in terms of the types of information at issue here. And we mentioned the certification already, which is in the name, so that makes sense. But when DoD announced its 2.0 version of CMMC, in response to a lot of comments that having a third-party certification was really burdensome and probably overkill, particularly for level 1. We now have certain circumstances where a self-assessment and attestation is going to be allowed versus having a third-party certification. We'll talk about that. Next slide. I think I already went over this. Oh, the important thing to note on this slide, so I mentioned that Title 32 DoD policy rule came out in December. That comment period is over, but the Title 48 rule that came out this month has a 60-day comment period, and we are still within that comment period. So anyone is able to file public comments on that proposed rule, and those are due October 15th. Next slide. This is DoD's chart for its CMMC 2.0 model. And you can see it breaks it down by the 3 levels. I'm going to focus today on level 1 and level 2, because I think as we saw, that's where the majority of us are going to be. So level 1 quickly has 15 stated security requirements, and we'll talk about what those are. That level, as I mentioned, it's going to be acceptable to do a self-assessment and a self-attestation. Those are going to be expected annually. So if you're at level 1, you can do an internal self-assessment, but you'll have to do that every year and then provide an affirmation every year. Level 2, we get more security requirements. This is for companies that hold DoD-controlled unclassified information. And DoD, as I mentioned, streamlined this. So now level 2, those 110 controls align with a publication called NIST 800-171, which is a document that was put out by NIST. That's a body that puts out standards and technical documents for government and for contractors. So that publication really spells out the security controls that are needed for level 2. Level 2, there's still a little bit of a question here on the self-assessments versus the third-party certification requirement. In the newest proposed rule that came out, I believe DoD indicated it was only going to be something like 2% of companies that it would expect would be able to do a self-assessment at level 2. So effectively, if you're at level 2, you're very likely going to be required to need that third-party assessment. At level 2, those assessments are required every 3 years. So a CMMC certification from a third party would be good for 3 years. But note that DoD does also expect an annual affirmation in certain cases. That affirmation is supposed to come from what they're terming a senior company official, who will have to affirm annually that the company is continuing to meet CMMC obligations. Then level 3 is for companies with even higher level of sensitivity of information or working on even more sensitive programs. That will require more than the 110 controls. There's a separate NIST standard called NIST 800-172 that sets forth the controls for level 3. That will be a government-led assessment for companies at level 3. Next slide. So digging in a little bit more, level 1 is for contractors that store, process, or transmit federal contract information. I've got the definition up here from the FAR for federal contract information. It is incredibly broad, and essentially, I think the way to think about this really is going to be any non-public DoD information that your company has that isn't, you can see here in the definition, that isn't simple transactional information. So not information that you would use kind of for any customer to process a payment or do transactional transactions with a customer, but essentially any non-public information you have under a DoD program. Interestingly, in the DOJ's complaint that they filed last week, they were looking at federal contract information requirements from the FAR, and we're also looking at restrictions on whether or not information could be made public. So they seem to be taking a pretty broad position on what federal contract information is, as really any non-public information that you're generating or receiving under a federal contract. So with the DFARS requirements currently in place, those are focused on controlled unclassified information, and that's what we'll talk about for level 2. And it's important to remember that even if you are a company that has controlled unclassified information, you're subject to those level 2 requirements. You're also likely going to be subject to these level 1 requirements, and it's possible you could have information systems with federal contract information, not controlled unclassified information, that might also be covered by the scope of this CMMC rule. So want to make sure people keep that in mind. Again, for level 1, it's 15 basic security requirements. The government has said these are kind of the requirements we would expect a prudent company to have in place. Now, that being said, I think most people on this call know when you actually look at those and try to do an assessment and document how you're complying, it can take some time and not seem quite so basic. But the idea here is that these are supposed to be 15 controls that are not all that difficult to implement based on the way most in industry set up their cybersecurity programs. Again, for level 1, it's an annual self-assessment and attestation. And if we can go to the next slide. I know this is very difficult to read, but I did put in each of the 15 security controls. This list comes directly from the FAR. I have the FAR clause listed in the blue box here on the slide. This is a current requirement in the FAR right now for companies that work with DoD, but also companies that work with civilian agencies for basic cybersecurity controls on their information systems with federal contract information. And you can see, I won't go through all of these, but it's things like having access control on your systems, so password protection. It's things like making sure that you authenticate users before they access your systems, having a process for sanitizing and disposing of information when it's no longer needed or before you're going to reuse a device. It also talks about physical security and escorting visitors within your facilities. So those are the types of things that are required under these basic controls. And also importantly, one of the key allegations in the DOJ's complaint that they filed last week was that the entity was not utilizing sufficient antivirus software. And they pointed to these requirements, which are currently in basically all government contracts, to say that these 15 requirements require contractors to install, run, and update antivirus software throughout their covered IT systems. So that's the first time I've seen the government really take a position on this and take any sort of enforcement action with regard to this FAR clause. Next slide. Moving on to level 2, this is really kind of the meat of the CMMC program, and I think as we saw from the poll, where most of you all are expecting to be. And that's not surprising because this does align with the current DFARS 7012 clause that I already mentioned, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But essentially, controlled unclassified information, I have the definition here, which is largely unhelpful. It's really any category of information that the government has said needs to be controlled or otherwise protected in some way. There is a CUI registry online that lists various categories of information that can constitute CUI. This is a government registry, so it's meant for internal government use. But of course, when the government shares that information or requires contractors to generate that type of information, it can become CUI. So examples of CUI categories that I think companies that are working with the DoD are most likely to encounter are controlled technical information, critical infrastructure information, export controlled information, and we have intelligence information here as well. But note, there are also many other categories of CUI listed on the registry. Export controlled information, as I think most of you know, has additional restrictions on who can access the information. It generally has, but in general, something that falls under a CUI category will not have a citizenship restriction unless it's specifically export controlled or has some other no foreign designation by an agency. I have the $1 million question here at the bottom of the slide that I don't think we're going to be able to answer in full today, but I wanted to kind of raise some issues to get you thinking about this. When DoD first put out its rule and when the federal government through NARA first put out its CUI program, set forth the program in the Federal Register, it talked about this and really left it up to the contractor to raise an issue with the government if they weren't sure about CUI. There was a lot of commentary on that and a lot of concern about that. And I deal with this almost every day now with my clients on let's making sure we can adequately define what CUI. But the idea was DoD now has come out and said it has a new policy and a directive to its officials saying they should be marking CUI that is provided to contractors. It may not always do that, but that is supposed to be what's happening. Where it gets a little bit more murky is where a contractor is generating information under a DoD contract that might be CUI. And there's a couple resources that speak to this issue. DoD has actually a great resource. It's called their procurement toolbox, and they have a section on cybersecurity with a long list of frequently asked questions. You can find it online on Google. But they do say that marking requirements for CUI should be somewhere in the contract. They should be in a CDRL. They could be in Section C of your contract. They could be set forth in a DD 254. So most of what we're seeing out of DoD with regard to their directives and guidance points to the fact that they should have something in the contract beyond the DFARS 7012 clause telling you that you're expected to protect CUI and what that might look like. But that's not always happening. So it's important to have an internal, I think, discussion, internal policies and processes for how you may mark material that is controlled under your DoD contracts. Because it's actually very interesting too. DCSA has a website with resources for industry on CUI that talks about marking of CUI, and they actually have a little warning at one of the bottom of their slides that says to industry, be careful, because once you start marking things as CUI, then you're now going to have network and safeguarding requirements to adhere to. So it's important to think about this question, I think, with respect to each of your contracts and programs, because overmarking actually has become a problem as well. So just so you're aware of that as an issue that I know a lot of you are probably already dealing with.
Hey, Townsend, this might be a good chance to address a question that I have and a question that Chris Nunnery has. And so his question was, what defines CUI besides the DD 254? And he's getting basically different guidance from different clients or different parts of his C3 PAO client. And so it sounds like you just gave us a great resource for that. Could you repeat that resource? It was this toolkit or something?
Yep, there are actually two resources I would recommend. So DoD Procurement Toolbox, if you just type that into your browser, it'll come up with that website. There's a cybersecurity link, and then there's an FAQ document. There's actually a lot of great information in there with regard to DoD cybersecurity if you have some time. It also has I control F it all the time to go back through different questions. The second resource I mentioned is DCSA's website on CUI. So actually, if you type DCSA CUI into your browser, it'll pop up with that page. And there's a tab for industry where it actually has industry training materials. It has some 101 type documents and other things to help industry on some of these questions.
Yeah, excellent. And Morgan, maybe we can put those links, and you're welcome, Chris. Maybe we put some of those links in our follow-up email that sends the video out as well. And so on that note, Trident gets RFPs that are completely unmarked. Some have been marked CUI, and that makes us cringe. And then some are marked properly as FCL. Do you have any guidance or thoughts on what should we do when our clients aren't marking things correctly?
It's a great question. So I think on both sides of it, if we receive this is not legal advice for anyone on the call, but this will be based on my experience and kind of my thoughts based on a lot of these different resources. If something is overmarked potentially as CUI and potentially there's a reason to think it shouldn't be, I think the best practice is to treat it consistent with the marking, but raise the issue with the government official to get clarity. I think the flip side of that is probably also true. If something's received that is either not marked or marked with a lower level of control than we think it should have, again, try to safeguard it in the way that we think it should be marked and raise that with someone in the government. I have had some situations where, and again, people within government also don't all have a fantastic grasp of these rules. So I've had certain situations where my clients have received things that are marked that have been sent, without any sort of encryption or controls. So we've gone back and said, hey, did you mean to mark this way? Because you sent it in an improper, we don't say it this way, but essentially you sent it in a way that's improper if you think it's CUI. So sometimes we'll go back and raise those issues.
So be gentle but direct with your client
Yes,
when they make a mistake.
I think that's probably
Excellent.
right. And of course, kind of taking a step back, all of this, right, it's meant to protect our national security. It's meant to make sure that we're not vulnerable to outside bad actors. So taking an approach that is keeps that in mind, obviously, is important. But as an attorney with my clients, I want to make sure we're also limiting risk and limiting the ability of DOJ to come in and say, well, you had all this stuff marked CUI that you weren't protecting, which is exactly what they did in this complaint. They point to several documents that Georgia Tech marked as CUI as evidence in their case. And I think there's a question about whether some of that actually needed to be marked that way. So that's why it is important to be careful with how you're marking internal documents.
Yeah, and I'm not legal advice from you, but I did like that you said, because a lot of our clients are likely going to go down the route of just mark it CUI just in case. But I love this guidance that, hey, you need to be thoughtful on that, because as soon as you mark it that way, if it doesn't need it, then it has to be treated a certain way. And so don't go down that route when you don't need to. I love that. So, hey, I just want to give you a time check. We have about 17 minutes left to get through a lot of material. I won't interrupt you again, Townsend.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'll move. I think this was kind of we got through some of the bulk of the most important stuff. So next slide, please. I think we mostly covered this. So we're still on level 2. This is the advanced level. Obviously, it requires 1. It aligns with that NIST 800-171 publication right now that requires 110 system security requirements to be set forth in a written system security plan. So having a written system security plan right now is a key requirement under the DFARS 7012 clause. That's going to continue when we get into CMMC level 2. I already mentioned the fact that this level is going to be bifurcated, although it seems like the contractors that are going to be able to rely on a self-assessment for level 2 is going to be pretty low. Next slide. I wanted to talk about scoping for a minute when it comes to level 2. Of course, level 1 needs proper scoping as well, but there is an assessment scoping guide. I've got the link to it here on the slide at the bottom. And it actually talks about the different types of contractor assets that should be included in the scope of your CMMC assessment. I think a lot of you are probably dealing with this right now. One of the main issues that's kind of come up with respect to the CMMC 2.0 program, and that a lot of the comments on the rules that have come out so far have focused on, is this idea of CUI assets versus security protection assets. So I've got the definitions here, but essentially a security protection asset is going to be something that provides a security function supporting your CUI assets or your systems that house CUI. So it could be something like endpoint detection, the routers that you're using, what information are they collecting? So assets that collect information about your CUI systems. In the proposed rule that came out in December, it actually talked about assessing the security protection assets against the CMMC practices the same way you would the CUI assets. So there's been some commentary about how this drastically could increase the scope of the program if you're now required to assess security protection assets in addition to your CUI systems against the CMMC security control. So that's something to flag for you. And I've actually worked with a couple companies, and I have some consultant friends that I kind of talk through these issues with on the idea of, if you have a security protection asset that's managed by a third party, how do you make sure that that third party is appropriately protecting the information? Do they potentially have to be FedRAMP moderate authorized? So those are some of the questions to think about when you're scoping. In addition to your traditional information systems that might house CUI, you're going to have security protection assets. You will also have contractor risk managed assets. So those are other parts of your system that are not necessarily going to transmit or store CUI, but you still want to account for those in your scope. So just to make sure that people on the call understand that there is kind of this thought exercise that I think needs to be done at the outset for where DoD information actually is sitting and which systems it's moving through. And that's going to look different for every company. I know some companies are looking at an enterprise-wide CMMC solution, while others are working on specific enclaves. So there's a more limited area where they're planning to house CUI within their own systems. Next slide, please. Level 3, I won't spend too much time on again, but this is the expert level. It's going to be for the most critical programs. There will be more than 110 security controls required. I did see one question in the chat. It looked like someone was asking, how would they know if they're going to be at CMMC level 3? I do have a handful of clients where the government has told them they're expecting them to be at CMMC level 3. So as of right now, I think that might be the only way you would potentially know. And I know that's not a great answer, but I guess if you haven't been told that you're expected to be at level 3 right now, you're probably okay at level 2. But again, the way this is going to be rolled out is DoD is going to put the required level in a solicitation. But of course, at that time, it could be too late for you to have enough time to get your CMMC certification by contract award. So if you're concerned about that, I would recommend probably reaching out to your agency customer that you think you're going to be working with to see if they might have a CMMC level 3 requirement. Next slide. Some more details about the program. I think most on the call already know this, but it's going to be applicable to pretty much all DoD solicitations and contracts, all DoD subcontractors, and then vendors and suppliers that manage or have to handle CUI are also going to have to be taken into account. There is an exception for exclusively commercially available off-the-shelf product procurements. So there potentially could be a carve-out for companies that supply exclusively COTS products. Another important thing to note about the program is on plans of action and milestones. Currently, under the DFARS 7012 clause, a DoD contractor is required to have a written system security plan that accounts for all of the security controls required, with plans of action for controls that they may not yet be meeting. So right now, the requirement is not necessarily 110 or 100% compliance with that NIST standard, but you're allowed to have plans of action. When DoD first rolled out the CMMC program, it initially said, we're not going to allow any plans of action. You have to implement all of the 110 security controls if you're at level 2. Now they've said there are some circumstances where POAMs may be allowed, none at level 1. At level 2, you have to have achieved a minimum score of, I believe it's at least 88 pursuant to DoD's NIST assessment methodology. And if you're at an 88, you would be allowed to have certain POAMs for certain security requirements, but the expectation would be that those POAMs are closed out within 180 days. So a little bit more wiggle room there, but still not a ton when it comes to having POAMs in place. Next slide, please. I mentioned this point already, but the proposed rule that we got in December talks about these 3 different categories of subcontractors and service providers. So I think subcontractors is pretty self-explanatory. The CMMC clause very likely is going to be a flow down that's going to be in subcontracts under DoD programs. But it's also important to note the DoD might dictate a CMMC level for subcontractors, or it could be left up to the prime contractor. And there could be situations where a prime needs to be at level 2, but potentially a sub could be at level 1 where the sub isn't having to handle CUI within its own information systems. The rule also breaks out a distinction between external service providers and cloud service providers. Right now in the DFARS 7012 clause, it does talk about external cloud service providers to DoD contractors, and that those external cloud service providers should meet FedRAMP moderate requirements or equivalent. So that's a security standard for a cloud provider. That's going to continue under CMMC. And if contractors are at level 2 or level 3, they can use a CSP that has a FedRAMP authorization or meets equivalent requirements. Kind of the new category is in the middle there, the external service providers. And I have the definition. So it's going to be an organization or a person, maybe consultants that you bring in manage your IT or cybersecurity. And those external service providers are going to be expected to have CMMC compliance at a level equal to or greater than that required by the contract. So again, this requires a review and thought about who you use for these types of services and what type of security they're going to be able to provide. Next slide. So the rollout of the program is planned to be done in 4 phases. So as I mentioned, that Title 48 rule is really the trigger. Right now, we're in the comment period. Comments are due mid-October. After the comment period is over, DoD will review the comments and they go through several phases of review, and then they issue a final rule. That process between the end of the comment period and issuance of a final rule usually takes at a minimum 6 months, usually longer. So we're looking at potentially somewhere early to mid 2025 that rule could actually go final. Once that happens, we start phase 1. So that's a 6-month period where self-assessments will be potentially included in solicitations and contracts. Phase 2, which will start 6 months later, is when the level 2 third-party certification requirements will start appearing in solicitations and contracts. A year after that, for phase 3, DoD will be able to put level 2 certification requirements in for options and level 3. And then a year after that, we get full implementation where the CMMC clause will appear in solicitations and contracts, and DoD will be inserting what CMMC level it expects for all contracts and option periods at all levels. So not everyone is going to be expected to be compliant on day 1. There is a bit of a rollout period, but it is, I think, important to get started early because obviously it does take time, particularly if you're at level 2, to do that assessment and get a third-party review completed. Next slide. The new proposed DFARS clause is in the rule that came out this month. I won't go through all of this, but it actually sets forth the obligations of the contractor under CMMC. So the idea that you have your CMMC certification or self-assessment done, you have to put in an affirmation with the DoD in their SIPRS system, SPRS, attesting to continuous compliance with the requisite CMMC level. You have to make sure that your subs and suppliers are also maintaining the requisite cybersecurity level and also put in the affirmations that they're required to do. So that's all kind of spelling out what we've already talked about, but it puts it in more detail. Kind of the new thing in the clause that we see in the proposed rule is number 4, which says that DoD contractors are supposed to notify the contractor within 72 hours if they have a lapse in information security or a change in the status of their CMMC level. So that's kind of a new one that I know that some comments that are already going in on this rule are asking for a little more clarity about that, because that could be a little bit more than DoD wants if they are getting reports every time there's a minor change or a slight lapse in service. Jeff, I know we're at 5 minutes. I have kind of the last part of this is more focused on current requirements, which I'm happy to kind of walk through, but I think we could go through the last 2 slides or the next 2 slides. And then the last portion really is just sort of a reminder on current FAR and DFARS cybersecurity requirements that I think people can look at their leisure.
Yeah, so Townsend, do you have a hard stop in 5 minutes?
No, I'm happy to stay on.
Okay, I know that Morgan does. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take over the share because I can go another 10 minutes as well. I'll take over the share. You just hit what you think is most important for this group in the next, let's say, 5 minutes, and then we'll leave 5 to 10 minutes to answer questions. So give me 1 second to share my screen. All right, and go into proposal mode here. And then,
Perfect.
Yep, and I think we're done with this slide, correct?
Correct.
All right.
Yeah, that's exactly where we were. So yeah, I think I'm done with this. We can move on to the next slide.
Okay.
So this is a little bit of a wrap up. We've got 2 more slides on this. So essentially the key point of that first bullet is the expectations for having your CMMC self-assessment and affirmation done are at the time of contract award. So DoD talks a little bit in the rule about how it thought about mandating that these requirements be met when you put in your proposal versus allowing for maybe 3 to 6 months after award to get compliant, but they've decided it's going to be required at contract award. So it makes it a little bit better than having to have it done at the proposal, but I think for practical purposes, you want to make sure you can get there early, because once you put in a proposal, you may not have time to get where you need to be at contract award, and that raises the question of whether DoD then would terminate or take away the award or what that might look like. But potentially they did this to avoid bid protest issues so that companies can't necessarily raise this as a protest issue. The other key point here on supply chain management, we talked about subcontractors and suppliers. The rule that came out this month does specifically mention foreign suppliers and says that they're going to be expected to comply. So I know there has been a lot of discussion about how overseas suppliers are potentially going to get assessed and certified, where right now we have a limited number of US-based assessors. So that is an issue that I know DoD is working through. And at least some other countries like Canada and I believe the UK are working on very similar cybersecurity programs. So there may be an opportunity for reciprocity there. Next slide. Thanks, Jeff. And I will end here. So this is our short list of best practices for getting started or continuing to work through your CMMC compliance. Of course, the first one is determine what level you need to be at. I think most of us already have done that, and we think it's level 2. There could be a question about level 3, but once you get to level 2, there are fewer controls then to get to level 3. So working towards level 2 right now is a good place to be. Again, this issue of scoping is important. So one of the issues in the DOJ complaint that came out last week was a failure of Georgia Tech to properly scope their cybersecurity system security plan. So they didn't have some of the devices that they used to have controlled unclassified information accounted for in their plan. So you want to make sure you're properly scoping your CMMC compliance to include the information systems that have both federal contract information and controlled unclassified information. Again, looking at your subcontractors and service providers is a very important part of this too. Where is the DoD information that you have going outside of your organization, and which third parties might be in charge of your security protection assets? And then finally, as lawyers, we love this one. Look at your internal policies and procedures. You might want to update those to be consistent with the CMMC requirements. Again, there's all those new security rules and issues that I raised at the beginning of this presentation. You also might want to take a look at those and update any internal policies and procedures as necessary there as well. And I know that was a lot of information for less than an hour, and I really appreciate you all having me. I will stick around for questions. I believe we're planning to share the slides. The last section of my presentation talks about current FAR and DFARS requirements and some of the new regulations, so not directly pertinent to CMMC, but it should provide some helpful background.
Yeah, we will be sharing everything. And just as one big takeaway for me, Townsend, is this service provider piece of it. So I'm literally going to send a couple of slides from your deck directly to our IT service provider, because they need to know, or they need to get out of the way. And let us know that they can't make that that requirement.
Right.
Couple quick questions. So Chris Nunnery again, if I had a prize to give, I'd give it to Chris for most attentive. So are PO A&Ms only allowed on 1 pointers, or are some 3 or 5 pointers allowed as well?
So I would have to go back and it makes
Yeah.
sense. Yes, it does. Thank you. I would have to go back and look for sure. I know that DoD in the Title 32 proposed rule that came out in December, it actually has the list of the controls that you can or cannot have a POAM for. I think there are no 5 pointers. but I'm not sure about the 2 to 3-quarter. And what the question means is in DoD's document where they have the scoring methodology, they assign a point level to each security control,
okay.
1 through 5. So 5 is, it's very important. It's very risky if you don't have this control in place. Down to 1, it's, you know, it's still important, but it's not as important. So I think you're allowed to have POAMs for maybe 1 and 2, but not 3 and 5. I would have to double check that, Chris. But if you want to shoot me an email, I can, I'll put my email in the chat. I can send you a resource on that.
Oh, right on. Thank you, Townsend. Another question. For level 2, the annual affirmation is usually stated in the contract ? So he's confirming that for level 2, the annual affirmation is going to be, you're going to know you need to do that because it's in one of your contracts.
So yes, and I guess is what I would say. So there's going to be the new CMMC clause that you'll see in solicitations and contracts that has the requirement, but the mechanism and the way the DoD is going to collect this information is through their SPRS portal. So if you currently have that DFARS requirement to report on your NIST self-assessed score, you're doing that in their CIPRS system. So you have to have an account and you log in and basically put in information about your cybersecurity assessment and your score. They're going to use that same system under CMMC for the continuous affirmation. So you go into that system and have somebody affirm every year that you're at the requisite CMMC level.
Oh, perfect. And it looks like we have one last question. I'll check the chat next. How early would you say the third-party assessment would be possible?
So that's a fantastic question. There certainly are third parties right now that are, they've gone through the process. We didn't even talk about this today, but there's a separate body called the Cyber AB that's responsible for reviewing and getting those third-party assessors qualified under the CMMC program. So we have a pool of qualified assessors right now. I would have to double check. I'm not sure that they can give you a certification yet. But I do know that some of those third-party assessors have been engaged by DoD contractors to at least have an assessment ready to go so that they can do it and give the certification once the program is effective. So that's another one. If you want to shoot me an email, I can give you hopefully a more definitive answer on that. I know that there are various stages of assessments happening right now. I'm just not sure when exactly you'd be able to get that official CMMC certification. With the program not being effective yet.
Right on. Yeah, I know that we're getting hit up by a lot of those service providers doing something that's not required yet, which is interesting. A lot of people are spinning up to do that. I just want to point out on the screen, we have 2 QR codes. Again, you're going to get access to this video. You'll be able to send the video to others if you want them to see all or parts of it. There's tons of resources in that first slide that introduces Townsend with links, and then you have these 2 QR codes that get you to Sheppard Mullin resources. And with that, I'll wrap up the webinar. Townsend, thank you so much for this information-packed webinar on CMMC. I know I certainly learned a ton and have action items from it, and I hope everyone else did as well. If you enjoyed it, please put in the chat your thank you to Townsend, and I'll stop sharing. And otherwise, we are gonna wrap up. Townsend, thank you so
much, Jeff. It was great to be here. Yeah, thank you everyone for sticking around.
Awesome. All right. Well, I'll go ahead and wrap up the webinar. Thanks everybody, and we'll see you at our next Trident contract. So that success webinar, make sure you sign up for the next one that's coming out. All right, take care everyone. Bye.